There we go. All right. All right. There's the turtle. That one.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, bud.
I see you found where you need to go.
Yeah, I had a buddy of mine came over, a lot younger man came over, and between the two of y'all, he got me going, and the instructions were good too. So where do we go from here?
So do you have a PowerPoint that you're going to share during this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a couple icons, and there'll be a computer monitor with a red line through it.
Yes.
That's the share button. So you need to have I think you have to have the PowerPoint already opened on your computer screen, and then you'll hit that button, and then you'll share your computer screen so we can see that PowerPoint.
So go ahead and I've got it in standby, but go ahead and click it like it's on the screen.
Well, as long as you've got it opened up, I think it's fine. And then hit that computer monitor button.
Yeah, it's opened up. Yeah.
Okay.
So, all right, I'm gonna hit the computer monitor button now, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Okay.
It'll probably give you some options to pick from.
It does. Yeah, I want the entire screen.
Entire screen, I believe. Yeah, is how you have to do it.
Okay. Well, it's not. All right. Let me try again. Okay. I clicked. All right. I clicked on entire screen, and do I click on the little button that says share audio?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it won't let me go any further. It says share and cancel, and the only thing lit up is cancel. Let me see if it. Oh, never mind. I got it. Never mind.
Yeah, you cooked the thing. Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. So. Okay. Is that it?
Yep, I see it.
Okay. Are they ready for me?
Whenever you're ready to go. I mean, it's a minute past, so if you're ready to start talking, just go ahead.
Okay.
I'm gonna log back out.
Okay. Can they see me while I'm doing this? They just see the screen, right?
You just did something to make your PowerPoint go away, so I don't know what you just clicked.
I didn't click anything.
Because right now I just see a circle.
I didn't.
Did you turn your camera off?
No, it's lit up. It says hop in to sharing your screen, and there's a button that says stop. I didn't do anything. I didn't touch a thing. I just straightened my papers up. What do we do?
Because I can still hear you, but I can't see you anymore, and I can't see your PowerPoint anymore.
Okay.
I can still see myself.
Let me look back on.
Stop sharing, and then try it again.
Stop. Okay. Okay. So, all right. Now click on that little screen.
Do you have your camera button on? Because I can't see you.
Both of the camera and the mic button are on, and I've got a red light on the camera, and I can see myself right above you.
Maybe I just can't see it.
Okay, so I'm gonna try the sharing again.
Okay.
Entire screen, share audio, share. Does it work?
Okay, we can see the PowerPoint now. We just can't see you, which is fine, but we can hear you.
No, that's fine. Yeah. Y'all don't need to be looking at me anyway. Okay. So we're ready. Okay, thank you.
I think you're ready to go.
Okay. Hey, folks. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon. I appreciate it. I want to thank, especially before we get started, thank Tanya Zimmerman for all her help. I'm sure she's going to be glad when this presentation is over with, because I won't be calling and emailing her every 10, 15 minutes. So she's been great to help me get going. I also want to thank the NCPHA Planning Committee for the kind invitation to participate in the conference today. I hope all of y'all are doing well. I wished I could be in front of you in person. Maybe one day we'll get back to that. I certainly do hope so. I'm not very computer literate, so this is going to be an adventure for us today. So y'all sit back. What we're going to do today, and I want to say right at the outset, I love history. I just always have. I think it may be part of that, may be because as I age, I'm starting to get into history. So we're going to spend some time this afternoon examining the rich history of shellfish in North Carolina and the role that shellfish have played in shaping the heritage, traditions, and economy of our state. At first glance, the topic of shellfish history may not exactly be very exciting or sexy to most folks, and I completely understand. But as we explore the topic today, we'll encounter Indians, scoundrels, and even pirates along the way before we're done. So I hope y'all enjoy this. Again, thank you for being with me today. And let's get started, shall we? Before we jump into how the role that the shellfish have played in their state and in history, we need to be clear about what shellfish we're talking about and a little bit about how and where they grow. As you can see from the slide in front of you, we'll only address marine or coastal shellfish in our discussion. We're going the primary commercially important species of shellfish, and those most utilized over the years in North Carolina, have been bay scallops, the eastern oyster, which we're all familiar with, and y'all know my spiel. If you have a health issue, don't eat them raw. Hard shell clams, or more commonly called hard clams, and ribbed mussels. Interesting note about bay scallops, as you can see from the photograph, those very iridescent blue dots that line the perimeter of both the top and the bottom shell are actually eyes. They're one of the few shellfish that have a functioning eye, and they got a bunch of them. So they're kind of cool, and they're the only one that can actually move around the bottom. They clap their shells together, and they can actually jet across the bottom in an effort to escape prey, or maybe pop over and talk to their buddies across the grass bed.
Yeah.
Yes?
Sorry to bother you. For some reason, you keep going in and out. Do you have a stable internet connection?
Yeah, best I know. So it's not working.
That way, your slides keep going in and out. So, like right now, we can't see the slides. We can just hear you talking. I'm not sure why. It's what browser are you using?
Google Chrome.
Are you on Chrome?
Yes. Are the slides still down?
So, like right now, it's just a blank screen where we could see your PowerPoints to begin with, and now it's gone back to a blank screen. I'm not sure. It worked fine this morning, so I'm not sure what's going on.
I don't know. I use this with Microsoft Teams, doing CIT presentations all the time. I don't understand what's happening. Nothing. I don't have anything else. I don't have anything else logged into on the internet. So let me I'll try to close out my email system and see if that does any good. I'm sorry, guys. Okay. I don't know what to tell you. Did I help at all?
No, it's still just a blank screen.
Do you want me to stop the sharing again and try it one more time?
Yeah, try it again and see if it'll fix it. Sorry, I thought we were past all these technical problems.
All right, stop sharing. Okay.
It's like I can see myself, but I can't see you.
Well, I can see you and I both. Okay, I'm gonna try to restart the sharing thing. Come on.
It was working good this morning on the presentations.
All right. That doing it good?
Okay, yeah, it's back up there now. Let's hope it stays there.
Me too. Sorry, guys. I don't know what to tell you.
All right.
I'll
let you know if I'll let you know if something happens.
I appreciate it. Y'all hang on. I told you this was going to be an adventure. Okay, these are the primary species we're talking about. There are a lot of other marine clams and mussels and different types of things. None of them over the period of the history of the state have been really utilized that much. So these are the ones that are going to appear more often in our story today. But I also need to mention that, of course, there are many species of freshwater shellfish inhabiting streams and lakes across the state. But other than basic subsistence for early Americans, they never were utilized for anything else. So we're going to leave those out today. All right. Where can we find these critters? Oysters pretty much are everywhere. They range the entire coastal area of North Carolina, south of Albemarle Sound down to North Carolina, South Carolina border. They tolerate they tolerate salinity changes, a lot different salinity, a wide range of salinity regimes. They can put up with pretty much anything. They're pretty tough. Clams are primarily more saltwater loving organisms, and they're found along the south side of the Outer Banks from around Hatteras Village down through the narrower sounds and bays down to South Carolina. Mussels found primarily associated with salt marshes near inlets, primarily from Cape Lookout area south to the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And bay scallops are very limited in their range. They thrive in natural seagrass beds, which most of them are primarily located in Carteret County from about Cape Lookout down to the New River. Okay, so with the wide area that oysters live in, it's no surprise that this humble shellfish is going to be a major character throughout our look at the history today. Habitats, I kind of touched on this already. I wanted to mention it again. Habitat played a big role in early use of shellfish in the state, especially in prehistoric and pre-colonial times. Ease of access and abundance of each of our shellfish species has helped form different harvesting methods and traditions throughout the years. Early North Carolina inhabitants lacked specialized tools necessary to extensively harvest clams, for example, and tended to rely very much more on other, more easily accessible species. Just a couple of pictures of what I'm talking about. The picture down on the lower left is obviously a salt marsh at low tide, and you can see oysters in the foreground and the marsh grass in the back. And if you got into the marsh grass and looked around the bases of the grass, you would see that there are rib mussels and other types of critters in there. So it's kind of like going to the grocery store for our early inhabitants. If they could see it and pick it up, it's certainly going to be a lot easier to get to. Bay scallops were not quite as easily accessible, but they're still pretty accessible. You can see there's a couple of pictures at the right of seagrass beds, and they are typically found in shallow, clear areas, lagoons, and shallow bays and that kind of thing, shallow sounds. And you can basically walk along and see the scallops on the bottom, and again, just stop and pick them up. So it's no surprise that these types of species were utilized much more than clams, which would have to be actually dug or found down in the sediment. The first harvesters of shellfish in the state were, obviously Native Americans as they began migrating into the coastal areas of North Carolina from other parts of the country. Many tribes inhabited all areas of the coast, most certainly relying on all types of seafood resources, especially oysters, for their survival. And I don't know about y'all, when I think of Native Americans, I tend to think, of isolated pockets of individuals and maybe a small village here and a small village there. If you look at this map, there were a lot of Native American tribes scattered across North Carolina, and a lot of them concentrated, not surprisingly, along the coast. So to me, it was fascinating to look and see that the areas that I have traveled and worked in my career with fisheries, all back in the Sounds, we were quite often in areas where early American Indian villages once were. And I think that's kind of neat because that's the way I roll. Evidence of utilization of shellfish by native people was evident, and probably still is, into the 20th century. Shellfish shells, which are lime and calcium based, deteriorate extremely slowly and were routinely tossed into piles or what's called middens, which over the centuries grew to be extremely large. This is an example of a midden somewhere along the East Coast, a picture taken in 1920. That pile is probably 25, 30 feet tall. You see it has trees growing out of the top of it. So there was a lot of oyster roast going on. Researchers discovered an interesting pattern as they dug into remains of shell middens in Virginia. Oyster layers in the earliest layers, oyster shells in the earliest layers were very large, sometimes up to a foot long, and subsequent layers yielding progressively smaller shells until the pattern would stop and then to begin to repeat. This indicates that this is the first evidence of what we term today stock management of a shellfish species. Larger shells initially harvested were likely from undisturbed virgin beds, and once the oysters were harvested and the beds revisited many times, the shell size eventually became too small to be useful. The bed would be abandoned and a new one be utilized, and the cycle would start back over again as the utilized bed rebuilt itself. So I think that's kind of cool. They learned, and they not have understood the science behind it, but they learned how to manage their natural resources even at that time. This is a picture, obviously was taken in 1976. Somebody was proud of that. Of a large shell midden near the Cape Lookout area. Shell middens were so abundant on nearby Harker's Island that all of the early roadways were paved with shell material obtained from the piles. So if you've ever been to Harker's Island, it's not a tiny place. There's a lot of roads around there, and that's a lot of material that they were utilizing to pave those roads with. Early explorers of coastal North Carolina were taken by the abundance of natural resources and their utilization by the native inhabitants. During the settlement of Roanoke Island around 1585, John White traveled down into the Pamlico Sound, where he encountered several Indian villages and documented their fishing and shellfishing techniques. Oysters and clams can be seen depicted near the bottom of this engraving, produced from a watercolor painting by White. White was the first European explorer to carefully document native peoples in the New World, and his collection of roughly 80 watercolor and charcoal sketches is the most complete record from that period. And if you have never taken time to Google John White art or portraits or drawings from the settlement of early America, and you like that kind of thing, you should, because they're almost like looking at a photograph. It is amazing, the detail. And you can look at this picture that we have here, this engraving. You can clearly see hammerhead sharks, stingrays, turtles, crabs, horseshoe crabs. And what is interesting to me as well is the fish weirs or traps that they have built. A lot of those similar designs are still used today in Pamlico Sound in something called pound nets. So that is just fascinating to me. A side note, he would also go on to write that during his travels into the Pamlico region, that as they left Indian villages, typically what they would do was visit an Indian village for a few days. He would do some drawings, and I'm sure they would exchange gifts and foodstuffs and that kind of thing. But as soon as they left the villages, they began to get word that people were beginning to mysteriously die. He wrote that sometimes a few, sometimes 10 or 30 to 40 would die several days after they left. And he had to curtail plans to explore further south into Core Sound down toward Cape Lookout, because as word spread of these deaths, the Indian tribes refused to meet with him for fear of his mysterious power. They thought that these early settlers could kill people with their minds, because they couldn't see what was causing the problem. Obviously, we know now they was introducing illnesses and diseases that the native inhabitants had no immunity against. So sort of sounds like today, kind of, doesn't it? In the 1700s, John Lawson explored the northern Pamlico and Albemarle Sound regions in the early part of the 1700s. Lawson, a surveyor by trade, founded the town of Bath, the first incorporated town in North Carolina, as well as New Bern, which would later become its colonial capital. He published a very successful journal of his travels in North Carolina in a journal in England, and he was quite the author. Unfortunately, though, and in one of the entries in that journal, he made a point of writing that in the area that he was in, that they found oysters great and small in every creek where they looked. So even then, people were paying attention to shellfish and to oysters, and he made special note of that when he was in those areas. Interestingly, though not fortunately for Lawson, he would be tortured and killed by Tuscarora Indians in an expedition in 1711, which helped spark the 4-year Tuscarora Indian War. So it's helpful to keep in mind that, there weren't a whole lot of highways back then. It was a lot of wilderness and a lot of wild places to go, and stuff could happen to you. Okay, as the new American colonies began to expand, with the increase of colonists arriving from England and other parts of Europe in the late 1600s and into the 1700s, native people were forced from their lands, or many, as we've discussed, perished from new diseases brought by arriving colonists. The new settlers utilized shellfish, like oysters and clams, for food, as well as building materials. Since lime had to be shipped from Europe to make concrete, which made it extremely expensive, the colonists adopted a technique from early Spanish settlers in the Caribbean. Oyster shell and clam shells were crushed and burned to extract the lime. Then the lime was mixed with shells, sand, and water to create a mixture called tabby that was a precursor to modern-day concrete. The mixture was used for walls, floors, roofs, and columns. Many examples of those early structures still stand today, especially in the southeast and down into Florida. This is an example. I couldn't find a real good example in North Carolina, but this is an example, the photograph at the top of a fort called the Noble Jones Fort near Savannah. And you can see that the base of the walls are still fairly in contact, fairly in good shape. And the little inset picture at the right, you can actually see the shells, oyster shells, embedded in that mixture. If you go to Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, and places like that, you can still see evidence of this tabby construction today. I thought, this really didn't have a whole lot to do with shellfish, but I just thought this was a cool picture, so I wanted to include it. This is a photo with the tabby construction remains of an 18th century building foundation at Old Brunswick Town, south of Wilmington. This was in 1961 as the USS North Carolina was being towed upriver to her New Birth in Wilmington, where you can go visit her today. But I just thought that was a neat juxtaposition of history and time changing there. So I thought that was cool. That one's on my house. Y'all won't have to pay me for that one. This is just one more good example of this tabby construction. This is a house down in Marathon, Florida. And I included it because it goes on to show how these tabby walls were sometimes finished with stucco to give them a smooth, pleasant appearance. And this is one of the best remaining examples of such construction. So I imagine in places like Bath and early New Bern and Wilmington and places like that, you would see the similar construction materials. Okay. Until the establishment of railroads, many of which were spurred on during the Civil War, shellfish harvesting remained in North Carolina, like other places, remained generally a subsistence fishery. With the transportation potential the new railroads afforded, coupled with new food canning techniques, the market, especially for oysters, exploded right after the war. The Goldsboro, New Bern, Morehead City Railroad was completed in 1858. And if you look at this diagram or sketch from an early newspaper, you can see this is Morehead City with Fort Macon in the background. And off to the left is a newly installed railroad that ran right through the middle of town. And if you've ever been to Morehead City, or if you're like me, if you live there and had to deal with the trains, those railroads are still there. And the trains run on a regular basis. And it can cause you some headaches sometimes. But they allow access to the port by railroad cars. So this is an example of they call them lighter vessels. This boat is deck loaded with oysters. It's arrived at the location wharf in Washington, North Carolina, Little Washington. This is around 1884. And likely what they have done is gone to different villages or loading points. And much like today with the large transfer trucks, they pick up deliveries here and there and then haul it to the shipping plant or the processing plant. So you can see we really got to rocking and rolling on shellfish right after the Civil War. And Morehead and New Bern both and Little Washington were huge shellfish export stations with the railroad access. In the early 1800s, the primary method of oyster harvest and clam harvest were either by hand, which is like picking them up at low tide, or using something called oyster tongs, which is like a big pair of scissors with a basket on the end of them. And these were used to harvest beds in water that was too deep to reach even at low tide. With an influx of oystermen from Chesapeake Bay, however, in the late 1880s, into the Pamlico Sound region came the introduction of a new harvest device called an oyster dredge. And these slides are pretty cool. The clam and oyster tongs that the gentleman has to the left are still being used today. And you never want to mess around with somebody. You don't want to thump a guy on the nose at oyster tongs all day long, because he is going to snap you in half like a celery stick. Those guys are tough. That's a lot of hard work. You can do that all day long. And off to the right is an early drawing that appeared in the newspaper of a barge load of oysters that arrived at a wharf. And the young man in the foreground is either using a clam rake or a set of tongs of some sort. So these things have been around a long time. Up until dredges showed up, that's the only way to pick the stuff up. Oyster dredges, this was a modern day oyster dredge that we used to use to sample oyster beds. Dredges were heavy, steel frame devices with a row of teeth along the bottom edge. These were pulled across the oyster beds to break oysters free and then catch them in the heavy net bag attached at the bottom. While very effective, these were and continue to be very destructive to the beds if they're allowed to be overused. And you can see the cable, or back then it would have been a rope attached to the very top, which would be on the right-hand side of your screen. And the teeth part is pointing down against the table. You can just make those out. And they are very effective at getting oysters, especially from very deep water. Some of the oyster beds we have in the Pamlico Sound are 15 to 20 feet deep. And, you can't tong them, or certainly can't pick oysters up out of there. And for years and years, many years, they stayed undisturbed because nobody could get to them. With the increased demand for shellfish, especially oysters, and the increasing conflicts over the use of public shellfish beds, this began to get the attention of legislation and the governor. Legislation was passed that allowed individuals who wished to enclose up to 10 acres of public bottoms for use as private oyster, what they called gardens at that time, in an attempt to appease local oystermen and give structure to the private use and public use of shellfish beds. 250 of these, what we term franchises, were issued in the 30 years that this program remained in place. And interestingly enough, 48 of those shellfish bottom franchises, because these things were permanent, they were perpetual. They could be handed down like property. 48 of these shellfish bottom franchises still remain in effect today, though very few of them are productively managed by owners. That's one thing that the legislation didn't include, that you had to actively and productively manage them. They just pretty much gave them to you. Also, the lure of increasing profits from oystering drew some other very interesting characters to the scene, as we're going to see. With, I mentioned Chesapeake Bay, guys, with decreasing oyster stocks in that region and an ongoing war between those individual states over oyster rights, many Chesapeake Bay oystermen saw the untapped deep water oyster reefs in the Pamlico Sound as a tempting target. Local North Carolina oystermen, and even the governor at some point, I think is Governor Fowle, viewed these outsiders as pirates and violent, sometimes bloody conflicts between the groups ensued. And you have to remember, coastal areas, prior to and even after, well after the Civil War, a lot of these coastal areas were very, very isolated. If you want to go to village, you had to take a sailing vessel. There's no bridges, none of that. So they remained very much to themselves. And the local oystermen in the different areas of the state, which is understandable, considered the local shellfish beds to be traditionally theirs and theirs alone to utilize, because that's the way it had been for generations. They saw the use of dredges by these pirates as a direct threat to their financial and traditional use of what they considered their God-given shellfish resources. And they were not happy to see these things coming in and these guys coming in. During this period, you also have to remember that law enforcement was not a phone call away like it is today. And conflicts of these types were often settled at the point of a gun between groups of men, whether on the water or not. By the end of 1891, the newly established Regulatory Shellfish Commission succeeded in having a law passed which prevented the use of oyster dredges on public beds and provided a patrol vessel armed with a 30-pound howitzer to enforce the new law. A howitzer, for you, those of y'all that don't know, is a cannon. And it's not that the cannon weighs 30 pounds, it's that it fires a 30-pound projectile. So they were quite serious about enforcing this new law. With that, when that passed and the appearance of that vessel, finally over 300, and this is, we had down here over 300 out-of-state oyster sloops departed the state for good, and that ended the Pamlico County Oyster War, as it was deemed. That commission, the Shellfish Commission, remained in place, interestingly enough, and eventually evolved into the present-day Marine Fisheries Commission, which we work under, that oversees management of the state's marine fishery resources, including the shellfish. So there's a lot of history that reaches in to all aspects of shellfish management with some of this. In these two pictures, the skipjacks with the traditional Chesapeake Bay oystering vessels. And you can see there's guys pulling a oyster dredge, looks like it's full of oysters, onto the vessel. Initially, in these days, these oyster dredges were pulled by wind power, but they were still very, very effective. They're beautiful vessels, and if you go up to Chesapeake Bay, you can actually take tours, and they'll take you sailing on these things, which I think would be cool. Okay. Excuse me, folks, I lost my place. Here it is. Sorry about that. Got my notes laying in front of me, and I still lost my place. Okay. This fella is named was named Lieutenant Francis Winslow, and he was in the U.S. Navy right around the time that all this stuff was going on. He turned out to be a very interesting character. Just following the eviction of the pirates from the Chesapeake Bay that were down here, he arrived on the scene. The extremely detailed and comprehensive oyster ground survey that he completed and published in U.S. Geodetic Survey remains one of the best of its kind ever completed, and is seen as an extremely valuable source of information for fisheries managers to this day. When I first started with fisheries, we actually used this quite a bit. It is an extremely detailed survey of bottoms and shellfish stocks in the Pamlico and core sounds. And we used it to compare changes over time. So he did a wonderful job with that. But as his work progressed with this survey, he began to see a potential for personal profit and personal gain. Money will get you every time. In 1887, as he neared completion of his survey, it dawned on Wilson that if he could get a loophole included in the recent law prohibiting dredging, that coupled with his newly acquired knowledge of oyster beds in the state, he could save the best growing areas for himself before his report was made public. He succeeded in having a codicil added to the law that allowed out-of-state vessels to dredge in water deeper than 8 feet. And how in the world he passed that, I have no idea, but he got it done. And at the same time, he started a company called the Pamlico Oyster Company based in Ocracoke. Now, can you imagine today the potential for or the perception of conflict of interest that would evoke? I don't think any of us would survive it. But, you know, it was a different time. At that time, Winslow was paying Ocracoke oystermen 5 cents a tub. And I want you to remember that figure. And I think the best I can determine, a tub is roughly 1.5 bushels of oysters. He was offering 5 cents for 1.5 bushels of oysters in 1889. When the Ocracoke and the Chesapeake Bay crews that remained were actually buying oysters from the local oystermen in Ocracoke, and they were offering 8 cents a tub. So Winslow refused to pay them the extra 3 cents, which didn't make him happy. When they refused to pay the lower rate, he hired cheap labor in New Bern and sailed back on vessels to dredge the deep beds around Ocracoke. Well, word got out that he was coming, and he was met by 40 oystermen in about 10 different boats, armed and intent on preventing his crew from working. Finally, they left the island, and Winslow filed charges with the sheriff of Hyde County over in Swan Quarter. And a subsequent trial found the oystermen not guilty, ending the brief Ocracoke, the 1890 Ocracoke Oyster War. I put up a note from a newspaper at that time. It says, Civil War in Hyde County. Ocracoke Island is in arms. Wilson and his crew have been driven from the island before the muzzle of shotguns. Well, they could play it up back then too, couldn't they, folks? I can't swear the last comment is accurate or not, but I saw it attributed to Wilson. He was supposedly had said, "I never saw the muzzle of a shotgun look so large." It's kind of interesting too, but everybody was claiming that everybody else was armed. Guns were pointed at each other and that kind of thing. When the court transcripts finally came out, it turned out that the Ocracoke guys had about 3 guns between them. One was a horse pistol, one was a muzzle loader, one was some other kind of gun. And Winslow's crew himself had several of them were armed. And apparently Winslow or one of his crew drew the weapons first on Ocracoke men. So just like today, things get blown up in the paper, but when the wash dries, you see what you have. So, but I thought that was interesting. We always held Winslow with such high regard because of the great work he did on the report, and he did. It stands by itself. I was shocked to learn that he was a little bit of a character, a little bit of a scoundrel that tried to cut corners and get gain through public trust. This is a very busy slide. Don't try to read all of it. I didn't put it up there because of that. But the main takeaway I wanted you to get from it was the obvious decline. These are oyster landings in North Carolina from 1887 to 1997. The obvious decline in oyster stocks and oyster landings. The unregulated dredging of oyster beds up until the early 1900s had a devastating effect on the deep water beds where the majority of mass is. Development increased and natural shorelines were disturbed. The resulting environmental degradation and silting of waterways adversely affected shellfish growing areas. Also added increased pressure on both clam and oyster stocks, which didn't help things. As if all that weren't enough, in the late 1980s, North Carolina experienced its first cases, and right after that, a toxic red tide event. And God help me, I was there for both of those. Remember them quite well. I was but a young buck. Hadn't been working for about a year. The oyster disease that we started getting reports of in 1987 were causing oysters. We were getting reports of large-scale oyster die-offs. And I remember going out with oystermen, and they were. I mean, you pull up oysters, and 90% of the clumps would be just dead. Subsequent testing revealed that the oysters in many growing areas had been infected with a disease known as dermo, which was prevalent in Chesapeake Bay at that time. We're not sure how it ended up down here. The disease starves the oysters of nutrients and usually kills them just before they reach harvest size, which is not a good thing. We have a 3-inch size limit on oysters in North Carolina, generally speaking, and these things were dying from 2.5 to 2 3/4 inches long, which was absolutely devastating. The presence of this disease drove the management strategies for that fishery for the next 15 years in the state in an effort to abate the problem. And talking with the folks in that program now, it's settled down quite a bit, but we're always holding our breath, and they're still testing to see where it is. Basically, what you have is the yellow pictures at the top are micro photos taken through a microscope that show stained globules of this disease in oyster gill tissue. And you can see on the left, it would just kill them. And it was pitiful. It really hurt our shellfish industry. A lot of it, especially these days, small scale oyster harvests are used to supplement bills around Christmas time. So this hurt us bad. In the fall of 1989, which I remember hearing about this the first day I was at an airport going to Miami, and I was listening to the radio, and there were reports of a yellowish cloud in the water off of Atlantic Beach. And my first thought was, oh God, I think we may have a red tide event. And sure enough, we did. This was the first known and hopefully the last ever red tide event recorded in North Carolina. Basically what happened is toxic algae from the Gulf Stream was pulled into the state's estuaries by unusual currents, and resultingly the toxin in these algae killed almost all the bay scallops. It killed a lot of fish, turtles, and marine mammals. Humans were also affected. I was living on the beach at that time, and we had to, even in the fall, we had to keep the windows shut and run the air conditioner because it would, when the waves broke, this stuff would become aerosolized, and it would make you, I was 3 blocks off the beach, it would make you sneeze and cough and make your eyes itch. It was terrible. And we had to, worse yet, we had to close the shellfishing season for that entire year. Shellfishing starts in October and goes, oystering goes from October to the end of March, and it was closed the entire time, which really hurt local fishermen that needed the money at that time. Hope we never see that again. It sucked. But we talked mainly about oysters so far because they have really driven the economy and been more intertwined with the history of the state than anything else. But we can't forget about them. Up until the 1950s, you pretty much had to hand harvest clams. And that still is probably the main way it is clam harvesting is done across most of the state. Beginning sometime after about 1950, a process for large-scale harvest of hard-shell clams called clam kicking was developed, and we think it was likely in the Carteret County area. You can see from the picture of the trawler that it looks like it's sinking at the back or the stern. In actuality, there are ballast tanks that are intentionally flooded to drop the stern deeper into the water to help divert the prop wash toward the bay floor, where the water flow blows sand and silt off of the clams, exposing them below. And then the clams are caught in a big basket-like smooth-faced dredge, for lack of a better term, you can see hanging on the back of the boat as it's pulled along. So no more hand harvesting. This allowed these guys also to get into deeper water where you wouldn't be able to get to the clams anyway. They started catching a lot of clams. Such methods greatly increased the harvesting of clams over hand rake methods. And subsequently, clam harvest landings have exceeded oyster landings in North Carolina. Clams are our biggest landed per pound shellfish product in North Carolina. They don't bring as much money as oysters, but we produce a lot more of them. The process is not without controversy, however. As you can see in the lower picture, in areas where clam kicking is allowed, this is an aerial view of, I'm not sure what it looks like, maybe Nelson's Bay or somewhere. It's not without, you can clearly see in this lower picture that there are long tracks or scars on the sand bottoms. And these are where clam kickers have worked along the bottom. So obviously this gear and this method can be very destructive to very sensitive critical habitat areas. And because of that, clam kicking is only allowed in specific areas, primarily to just contain bare sand bottoms. And it still causes quite a bit of controversy especially in some environmental circles. But it's interesting. If you ever see one of the boats, you'd swear it was sinking, but it's not sinking, it's making money. To help address problems with the shellfish, with the oyster industry, and the declining oyster stocks, a program called Oyster Rehabilitation Program was well underway in the 1970s with the Division of Marine Fisheries. This is a program I worked in when I first started years ago. The division added dedicated staff and several vessels to begin building culch, which is primarily oyster shells, culch beds, in order to give larval oysters a substitute a substitute, a suitable substrate to attach to and grow for later harvest. Generally speaking, around 150 to 300,000 bushels of these shells are planted, is what we call it, planted on the bottom each year in areas ranging from Roanoke Island down to the North Carolina, South Carolina state line. Several oyster sanctuaries have also been established around the state, primarily in Pamlico Sound. And these areas are, material is placed in these areas, and harvesting is completely restricted in these. So these areas will be left completely undisturbed in an effort to provide not only habitat for shellfish, but also all types of other fish and crustacean. Oyster reefs are extremely productive. They are as productive as coral reefs that you see in the Caribbean. Not nearly as pretty, but they are just as productive. This is a picture of one of the vessels. I think this one is based in Wanchese, the northern part of the state. And what they've done is they have a deck load of oyster shells on the front of the barge, and they use high pressure water, and they wash them. They get to the designated area that we want to put the product, the material, and they are washed overboard to build up a suitable substrate for oysters. It works quite well. And there's several different vessels. This is a smaller one. We also have a 130-foot vessel that can work in the much deeper areas and move a lot more product. Excuse me. These two pictures kind of give you a good indication of what culture planting sites look like. Areas that are suitable for oyster growth but have little natural substrate that is attracted to oyster larvae or provided oyster shell material and marl and that kind of thing to enhance natural larval settlement and growth. These efforts can have dramatic effects, as you can see in the picture on the left. It's kind of a before. There's a few scattered, looks like small oysters, maybe some little rocks or something out there. Then we spray the material, and a couple of years later, bam! You know, it's cool. It works well. I really enjoyed working in that program. I got to see a lot of interesting parts of the state. A lot of hard work, but it's something I'll never forget. These guys do a phenomenal job. Just like we saw earlier in the presentation, interest in shellfish and oyster gardening is still alive and well in North Carolina. It's actually had a resurgence in the last few years. The division shellfish leasing program allows North Carolina residents to apply for leases of suitable shellfish growing area that meet strict requirements. They can't have a natural supply of shellfish there already. We can't take a viable oyster bed and give it to one person. It's kind of like the culture planting program. You obtain bottom that there's good water flow, good salinity, everything is right, except there's just sand bottom down there. You need to add something to it or cultivate it in some way. So all of that is examined closely. All of them have to also go a public review and comment process. I remember back in the mid-90s, probably about 97, we had an application for leases out in Core Sound, backside of Ocracoke, and between Ocracoke and Cedar Island, down in that area. The local folks really got up in arms, and we had 400 very upset people jammed into a courthouse one night for the public hearing process for these leases. And I was scared that I wasn't going to get out of there with my head still on my shoulders. So fisheries management can be fun, and it can be dangerous. But people were very upset about it. There's a lot of money in it right now. At least there was pre-COVID. Growers were getting $100 for a 100-count sack of oysters, which comes out to about $300 or $400 a bushel. That's quite a jump from the 5 cents that Lieutenant Winslow paid in 1889, I think. Not sure how that's going to survive the closing of a lot of the markets and restaurants during the virus, and whether or not that will come back. But oysters have really been in high demand. Even so, like I said, just like in the 1890s, conflicts with other users and adjacent landowners does still occur at times. It has come to the point that over the years, certain sections, that part of Core Sound that I was talking about as an example, the public outcry was so great that a big section of that sound was completely closed in any leasing through legislation. So it could get contentious when you take a public trust water body or anything else and allow one or two people in a group, just say one person, to have all control over it. It's a lot of benefits to the program, but it's a very hard one to manage. So if you ever meet one of the guys that do it, give them a hug. They're going to need it. So in summary, we're blessed in the state to have some of the best shellfish growing areas in the world. And at least in my estimation, the best tasting oysters in the world as well, especially from Stump Sound. You cannot beat them. Shellfish have played an important, fascinating role in our history, as I hope you've seen, even before it was colonized. Shellfish have provided nutrition, livelihoods for watermen, traditions for families and communities, and resulted in sometimes violent conflicts over the years. I hope you've enjoyed this brief trip through time as much as I've enjoyed putting it together. I really did, and bringing it to you. And if you'll bear with me for 1 second, I want to recognize the following folks, especially Jacob Boyd with the Division of Marine Fisheries in our sister section, and Seth Swift from Henderson County. He does a lot of Ancestry.com stuff, doing family research for him, and he was great help for me in researching Lieutenant Winslow. So thank you to all of that. And I hope I got all the citations for all of these pictures. Do me a favor. I don't mind if you share this presentation with somebody. Don't print it and try to sell it because I'm not sure I got all my citations covered. So I don't want to go to prison right here before I get ready to retire. So anyway, here's my information. I want to thank you all very, very much. And Tanya, again, thank you, sweetie. I appreciate it so much. Please feel free to reach out to me. And if you're wondering who the two mermaids are, those are my daughters, Katie and Catherine, left to right, on the trip to Florida last year. And so proud of them. I can't stand it. You got to show your kids off every once in a while. So I apologize for the shameless display of pride. So I am going to get out of this, and I guess I stopped sharing.
Yeah, just hit stop sharing.
Hey, did it work okay?
Yeah, I think it went fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any questions. Nobody else can talk. So if anybody has any questions, I just need to put it in the chat. But I haven't seen any questions come through. So. Okay.
Well, I appreciate it. Sorry we had the glitch to begin with. So.
That's all right.
All righty.
We appreciate you coming and presenting for us.
Thank you again for all your help. I really appreciate it, bud.
Yep, no problem. Thanks. All right. Bye.